Well, a judge in a civil trial in New York has ruled that Donald Trump has lied about the value of his assets, inflating them to try and get cheaper loans, that he basically exaggerated his wealth by over $2 billion by lying about what his buildings, hotels, golf clubs were worth. He even vastly exaggerated the size and the value of his own apartment in New York. Now, this case will now go forward to a civil trial in New York next week over other charges of fraud relating to the Trump organization. If found guilty, they could be facing a $250 million fine. And this is quite separate from the criminal cases, the 4 different criminal cases that Donald Trump's also facing.
All right, folks, welcome to Dr. John Podcast Right Now. New York civil court records show Trump systematically inflated his assets by over $2 billion, lying about the value of buildings, hotels, golf clubs, and even his own New York apartment to secure cheaper loans. The judge's finding, based on actual financial statements Trump personally signed, reveals a pattern of deception so extensive it fundamentally calls into question everything he has ever claimed about his business success. Now, this case went forward to a civil trial in New York over charges of fraud relating to the Trump organization. And if found guilty, the organization could have been facing a $250 million fine. But this is quite separate from the criminal cases, the 4 different criminal cases that Donald Trump is also facing simultaneously. The scope of his legal exposure is unprecedented for any president, but this particular case, the financial fraud case, goes straight to the heart of his identity as a successful businessman. Here is what we now know from the court records and the exposed financial documents that investigators pored over for months. Trump and his organization made more than 200 false and misleading asset valuations on financial statements over a 10-year period between 2011.
We begin with the breaking news. A judge just ruling that Donald Trump, his sons, Don Jr. and Eric, and the entire Trump organization committed extensive and persistent fraud over a decade. The ruling says the former president inflated the value of his assets by billions of dollars and then lied about his net worth on financial documents to banks and insurance companies. This now leads to the cancellation of the company's New York business license, which means the Trump organization could lose control over properties like Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan. Tonight's decision is a major win for New York Attorney General Letitia James, who is seeking a fine of $250 million and a permanent ban on the Trump organization, including Trump himself, from doing business in New York State. CBS's Scott McFarland is going to start us off tonight. Good evening, Scott.
Good evening, Nora. Donald Trump launched his political career saying he'd mastered the art of the deal. A judge has ruled Trump inflated some of his net worth and some of those deals.
A judge has found Donald Trump engaged in fraud, overinflating the worth of his real estate holdings and misleading banks and insurers. The ruling comes days before the Trump organization is to stand trial in a civil case alleging years of fraud and misconduct brought by New York Attorney General Letitia James last year.
Claiming you have money that you do not have.
In 2021, let that number sink in for a second. 200 separate instances of inflating what things were actually worth on official documents submitted to banks. That is not a mistake. That is not an oversight. That is a systematic pattern of deception. We are talking about properties like Trump Tower in Manhattan, Mar-a-Lago in Florida, and his Doral Golf Resort down in Miami, all of them valued at numbers that had absolutely no connection to reality, according to the evidence presented in court by investigators who examined the actual records. And all of those fake inflated numbers were submitted to major banks specifically to get better loan terms and lower interest rates than Trump would have ever qualified for if he had simply told the truth about what his empire was actually worth on the open market. A New York judge named Arthur Engoron looked at all of this evidence very carefully and issued a ruling that should have ended any debate about whether Trump is the brilliant businessman he has always claimed to be on television and in interviews.
Does not amount to the art of the deal. It's the art of the steal.
In the ruling, the judge found Trump and top executives at the Trump organization lied about his assets in order to secure favorable loans and lower insurance premiums. In one instance, claiming his 10,000 square foot apartment was roughly 30,000 square feet. The judge summarizing Trump's approach to bookkeeping, this is a fantasy world, not the real world. The lawsuit from Attorney General James seeks $250 million.
And there cannot be different rules for different people in this country or in this state. And former presidents are no different.
When Trump was deposed in the case in August of last year, he pleaded the Fifth and then repeated it more than 400 times.
Is that correct? Same answer.
Trump has repeatedly denied wrongdoing and lashed out at James for bringing the suit.
This raging maniac campaigned for office, ranting and raving about her goal. Her only goal is, we got to get Donald Trump. We got to get him. She knew nothing about me. I never heard of her.
In a statement to CBS News, a Trump spokesperson calls the ruling fundamentally flawed. The judge has also ordered sanctions of some of Trump's attorneys, Nora, saying some of their arguments were, quote, frivolous.
Judge Engoron said that Trump and his company repeatedly committed fraud, and I want you to really hear that word because it matters. Fraud by inflating his net worth and property values on documents submitted to lenders who trusted those numbers. The judge called those financial statements fraudulent without any hesitation and found that they led directly to Trump getting sweetheart deals from banks that would never have been offered to him if the real accurate numbers had been on those forms instead of the made-up ones. And what was the penalty for all of this documented fraud that spanned an entire decade? Judge Engoron initially ordered Trump and his businesses to pay about $355 million plus interest to account for all the ill-gotten gains.
But first tonight, the breaking news involving former President Trump. Here in New York City, a judge ruling that the former president committed widespread fraud. The judge determining Trump lied for years about his net worth by inflating the value of his real estate portfolio. The judge finding the evidence so overwhelming, they don't need to go to trial. The former president accused, along with his two eldest sons, Don Jr. and Eric. Among the properties the judge found they inflated, his Fifth Avenue apartment in Trump Tower by as much as $200 million, and inflating the value of Mar-a-Lago in Florida by nearly $600 million. In bringing the suit, New York Attorney General Letitia James had accused Trump, his sons, and his business of overstating their net worth by as much as $2.2 billion, duping banks, insurance companies, and business partners. Tonight, the judge deciding the evidence is clear. So now what? ABC senior investigative reporter Aaron Katersky leading us off tonight.
Tonight, a judge in New York has determined former President Trump committed systemic fraud, lying for years about his net worth by inflating the value of his real estate portfolio.
That amount eventually grew to over $500 million, with all the interest factored in during the appeals process that dragged on for months. The court found that Trump's scheme produced what they officially call ill-gotten gains from cheaper loans and lucrative deals tied to his most famous properties around the country. This was not some minor technical violation or innocent paperwork error that anyone could have made. This was a judge saying clearly and unambiguously that Trump built his entire financial empire on a foundation of lies to banks. The deception was intentional. The pattern was sustained over a decade. The consequences for the banks were real because they made lending decisions based on false information.
The fraud was so overwhelming, the judge decided there was no need for him to even hear evidence or testimony at a civil trial set to begin next month. The judge found Trump inflated the value of his Fifth Avenue apartment in Trump Tower by as much as $200 million by claiming it was triple its actual size. Trump said Mar-a-Lago was worth up to $600 million when the judge said the Palm Beach estate's assessed value was no more than $27 million. The judge agreeing with New York Attorney General Letitia James, Trump overstated his net worth by as much as $2.2 billion. Duping banks, insurance companies, and other business partners into giving Trump, his eldest sons, and their family real estate business better terms than deserved. Trump has consistently denied wrongdoing and has attacked the Attorney General and her case. But tonight, the judge rejected each of Trump's defenses, calling them bogus and deceptive, and saying at one point Trump's denials were straight out of, quote, fantasy world.
And the benefit to Trump was significant because he got money at terms he never should have qualified for. Now, here is where this story takes a turn that should make every single American absolutely furious, regardless of which side of the political aisle you happen to sit on or who you voted for. In August of 2025, a New York appeals court threw out that massive $500 million penalty, completely gone, wiped away like it never existed. Trump does not have to pay any of it anymore after years of legal battles and appeals and procedural delays that most regular people could never afford. But And this is the critical part that everyone absolutely needs to understand. The appeals court left completely intact the determination that Trump was liable for business fraud based on misunderstood wealth and financial statements. Let me say that one more time because I really need this to sink in and I need you to understand what happened here. The court said, yes, Trump committed fraud. Yes, he lied to banks about his finances for years. Yes, he inflated his property values to get better deals than he actually deserved based on his real financial position. All of that stands as official legal findings that cannot be disputed or appealed anymore. But the punishment, the $500 million he was supposed to pay as a consequence for a decade of fraud, that just disappears into thin air because of legal technicalities about how the penalty amount was originally calculated by the lower court. So what we are left with now is a situation where the President of the United States has been officially found liable for massive business fraud by a court of law, and he faces essentially zero financial consequences for any of it. The fraud finding stands permanently on the record, but the punishment completely vanishes. The crime is documented for all of history to see, but the criminal walks away without paying the price that any regular person would absolutely have to pay for the exact same conduct. Let me walk you through exactly what was in these financial records and why the court findings are so absolutely devastating for anyone who still believes Trump's self-made billionaire mythology that he has been selling to the American public for decades now. Because when you actually dig into the details of what investigators found during their examination of these documents, when you look at the specific properties and the specific inflated valuations and the specific lies that were told to banks over and over again, you start to understand that this was not some minor exaggeration or optimistic estimate that got a little out of hand. This was a systematic, decade-long scheme carefully designed to deceive major financial institutions into giving Trump money in terms he did not deserve. Let us start with the basics of how this whole thing worked, because understanding the mechanism behind the fraud is really important for grasping the full scope of what happened here. When you want to borrow money from a bank, especially large amounts for major real estate deals involving properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the bank needs to know that you are good for it and that they will get their money back. They look at your net worth and your assets and your track record to decide whether to give you the loan in the first place and what interest rate to charge you for the privilege of borrowing their money. If you are really wealthy and have valuable properties as collateral, the bank gives you better terms because they figure you are a safe bet who will definitely pay them back. Makes sense, right? That is how the lending system is supposed to work when everyone plays by the rules. What Trump did, according to the court findings, was submit what are called statements of financial conditions of banks. Basically, official documents that lay out everything you own and what all of it is worth, so lenders can make informed decisions. And on those statements, Trump and his organization listed property values that were wildly disconnected from anything resembling reality or fair market value. Not a little bit inflated, the way someone might round up on an estimate. Wildly disconnected from any reasonable assessment of what those properties would actually sell for on the open market if a buyer came along tomorrow. The court found more than 200 instances of false and misleading valuations submitted over a 10-year period to major financial institutions. 200 separate lies on official financial documents that banks relied on when making lending decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Let me give you some specific examples so you can understand the scale of what we are talking about and why this matters so much. Trump Tower, the building with his name on it in giant gold letters right there in Manhattan that everyone associates with his brand, was valued on these financial statements at figures that bore absolutely no relationship to what real estate professionals said it was actually worth based on comparable sales and market conditions. Mar-a-Lago, his Florida club that he now uses as basically a second White House where he conducts official government business, was valued at numbers that completely ignored legal restrictions on the property that would make it worth far less if it ever actually had to be sold to a buyer. His Doral Golf Resort in Miami was inflated beyond any reasonable estimate of its actual market value based on what similar properties were selling for at the time. And these were not just casual estimates that Trump threw out there without thinking about the consequences or implications. These were formal financial statements submitted to major banks like Deutsche Bank to secure hundreds of millions of dollars in loans that Trump used to expand his empire and maintain his lifestyle. The banks relied on these numbers completely when making their lending decisions because that is what banks do. They trust that borrowers are telling the truth on official documents. They gave Trump better interest rates and more favorable terms because they believed, based entirely on the documents he submitted to them, that he had the wealth to back up the loans if anything went wrong. If Trump had told the truth about what his properties were actually worth, he would have gotten much worse terms or might not have gotten the loans at all because banks would have seen him as a riskier borrower. Judge Engoron called this exactly what it was: fraud. Not aggressive negotiating tactics that push the boundaries of acceptable business practice, not optimistic valuations that any entrepreneur might engage in when trying to secure financing. Fraud, pure and simple and unmistakable. The judge found that Trump's financial statements were fraudulent and that they were specifically designed to mislead banks into giving him things he did not deserve based on his actual real financial position. This is a sitting judge examining the actual documents and the actual evidence over months of testimony and concluding officially that the President of the United States built a significant portion of his business success on deliberate, calculated lies to financial institutions that trusted him. Now, here is where the story gets even more infuriating, when you think about how the system is supposed to work versus how it actually works for people with enough power and money to game it in their favor. The initial penalty that Judge Engoron imposed was about $355 million, designed specifically to strip away the ill-gotten gains that Trump received from the fraud, plus additional penalties for the seriousness of the conduct and the duration of the scheme. With interest accruing during the lengthy appeals process, that number grew to over $500 million by the time everything was calculated. That is the kind of penalty that should make even a billionaire pay serious attention and think twice about lying to banks in the future. But Trump has access to something that regular people facing fraud charges absolutely do not have: an army of expensive lawyers and essentially unlimited resources to fight in court for years and years until something finally breaks in his favor through technicalities or procedural errors. And that is exactly what happened in this case. The appeals court that reviewed the case did not say Trump was innocent of the fraud charges. They did not say he did not commit fraud against the banks. They did not overturn the findings about the false valuations and the deceptive financial statements that formed the basis of the entire case. What they did was throw out the penalty on technical grounds related to how the damages were calculated, essentially saying that while Trump definitely committed fraud over a decade, the specific dollar amount of the punishment was not properly justified under the applicable law. So now we have this completely absurd situation where the fraud finding stands as established legal fact that nobody can dispute, but the punishment disappears entirely. Trump lied to banks for a decade. That is official and on the record forever. Trump inflated his property values by hundreds of millions of dollars. That is official and documented in court findings. Trump secured loan terms he absolutely did not deserve based on fraudulent financial statements. That is official and cannot be appealed or overturned. But the money he has to pay back for all of this documented fraud? $0. Nothing at all. The $500 million penalty is completely gone, and Trump walks away from the whole thing having faced essentially no meaningful financial consequence whatsoever for what the courts have confirmed was massive systemic fraud spanning an entire decade of his business career. Compare this outcome to what happens to regular people who commit bank fraud on a much smaller scale. If you lie on a mortgage application to get a loan you cannot actually afford, if you inflate your income or your assets to qualify for terms you do not deserve, you face federal criminal charges that can send you to prison. Bank fraud is a serious crime that can result in years in prison, plus massive fines, plus forfeiture of everything you gain through the fraud. People go to prison for this stuff all the time because the FBI has a whole unit dedicated to investigating mortgage and bank fraud, since it is considered a serious threat to the integrity of the entire financial system. But when Trump commits the same type of fraud on a much, much larger scale, fraud involving hundreds of millions of dollars and inflated valuations over a full decade, the penalty gets thrown out on technical grounds and he walks away without paying a single dime. The message this sends to everyone watching is unmistakable. If you have enough money and enough power and enough lawyers willing to fight for years, you can commit fraud and get away with it completely. The rules that apply to everyone else simply do not apply to you because you have the resources to litigate until the consequences disappear. And this completely undermines Trump's core brand as a business genius and master dealmaker that he has spent decades carefully cultivating through television appearances and interviews. The whole Trump mythology is built on the idea that he is this incredibly successful businessman who knows how to make money and negotiate deals better than anyone else in the world. His supporters believe he can fix the economy because he was so successful in business. But what the court records actually show is that his success was significantly built on lying to banks about what his properties were worth rather than on genuine business acumen. He did not get those favorable loan terms because he was such a brilliant negotiator or such a valuable client that banks wanted to work with. He got them because banks were working with completely false information that he deliberately provided to deceive them into giving him money. The fraud was not a minor part of his business operations. It was central to how he built his empire. The inflated valuations were not occasional errors. They were a systematic pattern over a decade. The deception was not incidental. It was intentional and carefully designed to extract better terms than he deserved. We now have a president making economic decisions for the entire country who has been officially found liable for massive financial fraud by a court that examined his actual records. Think about that for a second and really let it sink in. Trump is setting trade policy that affects every business in America. He is influencing interest rates through his appointments and public statements. He is making decisions about tariffs and government spending and economic strategy, all things that require trust in his financial judgment and basic honesty about numbers. And while he is doing all of this, there is an official court record sitting right there saying he cannot be trusted to tell the truth about basic numbers on financial documents. He spent a decade lying to banks about what his properties were worth, and now he is in charge of the largest economy on earth, making decisions that affect 300 million Americans. The retribution angle makes this even more disturbing because Trump is actively going after the people who exposed his fraud using the power of the federal government. Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, whose investigation uncovered all of this fraud and brought it to light, has faced an indictment from Trump's Justice Department on what many legal experts consider highly questionable charges that look like retaliation rather than legitimate prosecution. The pattern here is very clear for anyone paying attention. Expose Trump's misconduct and document his fraud, and you become a target yourself. This creates a chilling effect where future investigators and prosecutors have to think very carefully about whether investigating powerful people is worth the risk of having the full weight of the federal government turned against them in retaliation for doing their jobs. The message is unmistakable. Cross Trump and face the consequences. Expose his wrongdoing, and he will use the power of the government to destroy you. The broader implications for the rule of law in America are genuinely frightening when you think through what this means for the future. If documented massive fraud by a president results in no meaningful consequence whatsoever, if the finding of liability stands permanently but the punishment completely disappears, then what exactly are the limits on what powerful people can do in this country?
Well, I am wondering if Rosen 5 is the leader.
What is the point of having laws against bank fraud if someone with enough resources can simply litigate their way out of any penalty through technical arguments and procedural delays? What message does this send to other wealthy people who might be tempted to lie on their financial documents knowing they can probably escape consequences too? The whole system of laws that is supposed to apply equally to everyone starts to look like a complete joke when cases like this play out exactly the way this one has. The fraud is documented and officially established by a court of law, regardless of what happened to the penalty afterward. This is not disputed by anyone who has actually read the court documents and understands what happened. This is not partisan spin from Democrats trying to make Trump look bad before elections. A judge examined the actual financial records and the actual documents that Trump submitted to banks over a decade and concluded that they were fraudulent. That specific legal term. More than 200 false valuations over 10 years designed to deceive lenders, inflated property values submitted specifically to secure better loan terms than Trump deserved. Deliberate misrepresentations of net worth to major financial institutions that relied on those numbers. All of this is now part of the official permanent legal record, and no amount of appeals or political spin or media commentary can change the underlying findings about what Trump actually did. The elimination of the penalty while leaving the fraud finding intact creates a two-tier justice system that absolutely everyone can see operating in plain sight. Regular people who commit bank fraud face prison time and complete financial ruin that destroys their lives and their families. They lose their homes and their savings and their freedom because the system comes down on them with the full weight of the law. Bank fraud is considered a serious crime that undermines the integrity of the entire financial system that our economy depends on. But when Trump commits the same type of fraud on a much, much larger scale, fraud involving hundreds of millions of dollars and inflated valuations over a full decade, the penalty gets thrown out on technical grounds and he walks away without paying a single dime. The message this sends to everyone watching is unmistakable. If you have enough money and enough power and enough lawyers willing to fight for years, you can commit fraud and get away with it completely. The rules that apply to everyone else simply do not apply to you because you have the resources to litigate until the consequences disappear. This is not how justice is supposed to work in a country that claims to believe in equal treatment under the law. This is how justice works in a country where the wealthy and powerful have figured out how to game the system to their advantage. None of this is going away anytime soon, and the implications will continue to ripple through American politics and the justice system for years to come. Regardless of what happens next, the fraud findings are part of the permanent legal record that historians will examine for generations. Future scholars will look back at this period and see a president who was officially found liable for massive business fraud while simultaneously holding the most powerful office in the world and facing no consequences for it. The appeals court decision that eliminated the penalty while keeping the fraud finding creates a precedent that other wealthy defendants will absolutely try to exploit in their own cases. And the retribution against Letitia James sends a signal to anyone else who might think about investigating powerful people that they should probably think twice. Where does all of this leave us as Americans who supposedly believe in equal justice under law? Honestly, it leaves us in a pretty dark place when it comes to accountability and the basic premise that the rules apply to everyone the same way, regardless of wealth or power or political connections. We have a documented case of massive fraud, over 200 false valuations over a decade designed to deceive major banks. We have a court finding that this conduct was fraudulent and that it resulted in ill-gotten gains for Trump and his organization. And we have a system that ultimately produced no meaningful consequence whatsoever because the defendant had enough resources to fight until the penalty went away through technicalities. The bank records were exposed for everyone to see. The massive fraud was documented in official court findings. The judges examined everything and said it happened exactly as investigators claimed. And nothing really changed because power protects its own in this country. This is the reality of American justice. The rules exist on paper, but they do not apply equally to everyone in practice. The wealthy and powerful can commit fraud on a massive scale and walk away without paying the price that any regular person would be seen by a private set of conducts. So we are looking for the deadline man of the party, and the rules of the system need nothing. And the person found liable for all of this fraud is now sitting in the Oval Office making decisions about the economy that affect all of our lives every single day. Let me be completely honest with you about something. I do not know what the solution is. I do not know how you fix a system that produces outcomes like this one. But I do know that we cannot just pretend it is not happening. We cannot just move on to the next scandal and forget that courts have officially found that the President of the United States spent a decade lying to banks about his finances. We have to keep talking about it and keep demanding better, even when it feels like nothing ever changes and nobody in power is listening. The fraud finding is not going to disappear. It is part of the permanent legal record. Historians will write about this. Law students will study this case. The precedent will be cited in future cases. And every time someone tries to claim that Trump is a brilliant businessman who built his empire through sheer talent and hard work, the documented court findings will be there to contradict that narrative. The truth is now part of the official record, and no amount of spin or denial can change that. What is most concerning about all of this is that it fits a larger pattern. Trump has spent his entire career avoiding accountability through a combination of wealth, power, and procedural gamesmanship. He has relied on the fact that suing someone rich and powerful is expensive and difficult, that courts are slow and cautious, that appeals can drag on for years, that the system is designed to favor those who can afford to wait and fight. And in this case, that strategy worked exactly as intended. The fraud was documented and proven, but the consequences were eliminated through technicalities. The fraud finding stands as a permanent indictment of Trump's business practices and character, and the precedent set sends a dangerous message that fraud is okay if you have enough money to fight until the penalty goes away. The legal battles are not over, and the implications of what has been exposed will keep reverberating through American politics long after the headlines fade.